Hey, thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Jennifer Kincaid and I'm the president of Missouri Rehabilitation Association. And MRA is excited to kick off this series of Wednesday webinars representing your favorite tracks from conference. I want to say a huge thank you to our board and all their work in pivoting from the traditional conference we typically have to this virtual platform. A couple items before we get started. The usual, please keep yourself on mute so we can hear our presenter. The session will also be recorded and posted to MRA's brand new YouTube channel. And I will share that link in the chat box throughout the presentation so you can make sure to get that. I'll also share with you links for our website and our social media pages. Also, please use the chat box to ask your questions and we will be monitoring those and answering them throughout the presentation. The webinar today will be closed captioned and a link has been provided in the chat box. In case you missed it, I'll grab that and repost it a couple times too. We will provide information about how to request CEUs at the end of the presentation, so you'll get more details in a little bit. But without further ado, I'm so happy to introduce you to our speaker. Elizabeth Makulec has been working in the field of suicide prevention since 1994. Working specifically with youth development, mental health advocacy, and prevention skills training. She is a master trainer of ASSIST, CALM, QPR, and Safe Talk suicide prevention models, and an instructor of youth and adult mental health first aid. We are so appreciative that she is collaborating with MRA to offer this webinar on the very important topic of suicide safety. I'll turn it over to you, Elizabeth.
Thanks a lot, Jennifer. And I really appreciate the invitation from MRA to participate in the Wednesday webinars. I always welcome the opportunity to have conversations with different folks in different fields because I am of the belief that everyone has a role to play in preventing suicide, and the more we are on the same page with what suicide prevention might look like, the better prepared we're going to be able to do that. I also want to just footnote, as Jennifer said, if you have any questions as we're going through the material, please feel free to post them in the chat. At the conclusion of the presentation, I'm hopeful that we'll have some time for some Q&A if we didn't cover everything, so that's another option as well. I do want to just bring up the point that it's not unusual for folks to, in some cases, feel overwhelmed or connect with a personal experience that they may have had related to suicide. And I want to let you know that if something like that occurs for you, if you feel overwhelmed or you're feeling a little anxious about the material, to please take care of yourself. Step away from the webinar perhaps, get a drink of water, do a few deep breaths. If you feel that you need to connect with someone, please feel free to private chat with Jennifer and connect with her. We just want to make sure that people feel safe and people feel connected to support and help should they need it. The other thing that I want to say is that at the conclusion of our presentation, I'm going to post a couple of documents in the chat box. One is an online version of this booklet, Question, Persuade, Refer, which captures everything that we're going to be talking about today. And then the other is this wallet card that you can write your own resources, your own community resources on, and it also has the steps that we're going to be talking about as we go through this presentation today. So I'm coming into this presentation with the belief that we're a diverse group of folks that perhaps maybe aren't 100% sure why suicide should be on their radar. So what I want to do is share a brief little video clip with you about why QPR and suicide prevention are something that everyone should be alert and aware of and recognize what the role is that we can play in helping people stay safer.
It may be hard to imagine, but according to the World Health Organization, over 800,000 people die each year by suicide. That is more people than are killed in all the wars and homicides combined. Of these deaths each year, more than 40,000 are Americans. That is one death by suicide every 13 minutes. Suicide affects every region of the world and is the third highest cause of death for people aged 15 to 44. And for every life lost, another 25 people will attempt suicide, often causing serious medical injury or lifelong disability. Today, the greatest loss of life is among working-aged men 35 to 65 years old. Men of all races and ethnicities are at higher risk. And from the very young to the very old, millions of Americans think seriously about suicide for days, weeks, and even years. Thinking seriously about suicide is itself a kind of misery index, a sign that something is terribly wrong and needs attention. Most often, what needs attention and treatment is clinical depression, a medical condition that is now the leading cause of disability in the world. In America alone, there are an estimated 15 million sufferers. Most of us are touched by suicide. Some of us have lost family members, loved ones, friends, schoolmates, or colleagues. None of us escapes the loss of people we admire and respect, whether they are people we know or are much-loved musicians, artists, and entertainers. If you have lost someone close to you to suicide, then you already know the considerable cost, the tears and awful pain of loss. And if you are one of the millions who have thought seriously about suicide, then you already know just how lonely and terrible it is to suffer alone. Depression, anxiety, substance abuse, bipolar, and thought disorders like schizophrenia all contribute great risk for suicidality. Yet most people suffering from a mental illness do not kill themselves. They get help, they find a way, and they recover to live full and productive lives. And if recovery is possible, that means suicide is preventable. Thankfully, the world is changing. We understand mental illness. We understand suicide. And we know that treatment saves lives. Right now, our teachers don't teach us about depression and suicide. And our faith leaders often struggle to talk openly about these topics. Too often, doctors can't talk to their patients about suicide, even patients who are sitting in their offices planning how to end their lives, perhaps by overdosing on the medication being prescribed to them. The world remains dangerously ignorant about suicide. So to save lives, we must bring the subject out of the shadows. Effective treatment would save thousands of lives around the world. But we must learn to talk comfortably about suicide, and we need your help to start the conversation. Join us in this fight, a fight to save lives. Preventing suicide, it's what people do.
So I think we're all in agreement that just by the fact that you're here in this webinar, that suicide is something that you want to learn a little bit more about. I want to share just some data that I think is important, that frames the importance of having this conversation. In my introduction, Jennifer said that I had been in this field for quite a long time. And I can tell you that in the over 25 years that I've been doing suicide prevention, loss of life to suicide has consistently been in the top 10 leading causes of death. We can see that there are significant physical losses of life, but that intentional self-harm is number 10. So much more so than homicide. But unfortunately, what we hear the most about are the homicide deaths. We believe, those of us in the field of suicide prevention, that we need to do more talking about suicide, talking about some of the realities and how significant the touch can be, as well as how we can take simple steps to prevent suicide from continuing to occur. This is just a slide that's going to show us that unfortunately the threat of suicide is not diminishing yet. It continues to climb and continues to grow. One of the concerns that we have in this field is on surveillance and data reporting. And 2018 is the most current year for data that is reliable. This is national information. It comes from the American Association of Suicidology, as well as from the CDC, Centers for Disease Control. And so I share this information just to give you an image that even though we are opening our ears and our hearts to having conversations around mental health concerns, and trying to be supportive and reduce the impact that suicide has in our communities, we need to keep doing more. The frequency of suicide, you heard a little bit about this in the intro video. There are about 130 suicides every day. And so that's about the same number of folks that might be in an aircraft traveling from St. Louis to Florida for vacation, 128 people. If there was an aircraft going down every single day, we would be taking significant steps to improve safety and to enhance awareness that we need to do a better job helping people to stay alive. We also know that suicide has a significant impact on young people. And in this field, we consider the age group 15 to 24 as a young person. So it captures both adolescents as well as young adults. And we know that it's a significant loss. This slide is really just to share with you compared to our neighboring states where Missouri sits. So out of all 50 states and 2 territories, Missouri is number 12. So we are the same rate, and rate of suicide is the number of people per 100,000 population. You can see in 2018, a little over 1,200 folks in Missouri died by suicide. And when you compare that nationally, you can also see that our rate of suicide is much higher than the national rate of suicide. What else is important on this slide? I think one of the important takeaways is the size of the state doesn't necessarily have an impact as much as the population of the state when we're talking about rates. This next slide that we're going to take a look at, it has to do with estimated attempts of suicide. And while we can count the number of people that have lost their lives to suicide, it's sometimes difficult to document how many people have taken steps to end their life. Most people who make a suicide attempt do not show up in the emergency room or seek medical care or psychiatric care for their attempt. In most cases, people who are struggling with thoughts or feelings of suicide struggle in silence and struggle by themselves. But we know, based on just some ancillary research that's been done, that for each suicide that is a documented death, we know that there are as few as 25 people who may have made an attempt to end their life. So those 48,000 suicides that we are able to count translates into more than 1 million people that are walking day-to-day attempters who are struggling to find help and hope to find a life worth living. So the impact of suicide, we use language a little differently in the field of suicide than in many other fields. We talk about dying by suicide or death by suicide. We try not to use the word committed because there are so many negative connotations, and it's very stigma impactful using that word. We also talk, I use the language attempter, folks that have followed through on a plan to try to end their life, and that plan did not result in their death. We talk about loss survivors, people that have lost someone to suicide. We talk about lived experience, people who have some degree of experience with suicide, either personally or in their family. But what we have learned is that one death by suicide easily touches 204 people. 115 folks are typically exposed to that death, either they know that person socially or within their community. 53 people are in some way emotionally impacted by the loss. 25 people have some degree of bereavement, depending on their closeness to that individual. And 11 folks are profoundly bereaved. And when we say profoundly bereaved, that's typically the closest folks, loved ones and family members. These are the survivors of suicide, the people that are left behind to try to make sense of the loss, to try to make some sort of meaning, or to try to pick up the pieces. And the impact of suicide can have a significant impact on small communities. So we see significant impact with students in schools. So community really depends on what that population looks like, whether it's a peer group, whether it's a school, whether it's a county, whether it's a state. So question, persuade, refer. QPR is one of the longest running structured suicide prevention education programs that's been around. It was founded by Dr. Paul Quinnett, and his philosophy is that there are specific things that we can do as friends and family members, colleagues and coworkers, that can provide support and care ahead of a suicide crisis. So while we're talking about folks who are experiencing significant feelings of suicide, doesn't necessarily always mean that they are actively suicidal. People can carry their thoughts of suicide and never take any action on them for a very long time, sometimes years. Sometimes people experience suicidal thoughts or feelings that are so overwhelming that they take action on them very quickly. So our hope with the QPR model is that by being aware of some of the warning signs, some of the things to be alert for, we can intervene and have a conversation with someone long before their thoughts or feelings of suicide escalate to making a plan or to making an attempt. QPR is based on the same theory as CPR, that there are small tasks that any of us can learn that in the moment can be life-saving. I'd like to share another short video clip with you that really delves a little bit deeper into the QPR model.
Research shows that the odds of surviving a heart attack in a public place are 10 times greater in regions where thousands of ordinary citizens are trained in CPR. It's called bystander rescue. When someone shows signs of experiencing cardiac arrest, the response of nearby friends, family, or coworkers is critical. The effective use of CPR doubles or triples one's chances of surviving a heart attack. Like CPR, QPR is an emergency intervention for someone experiencing a life-threatening crisis. QPR is easy to learn and easy to remember, but it takes courage to overcome our fears about reaching out to help someone who may be considering suicide. Research also shows that where QPR is widely taught, suicide attempts and deaths decrease. Just like CPR, QPR requires quick, bold, and informed action. Because suicide, like heart attacks, remains a rare event, we must train hundreds to save one, thousands to save hundreds, and millions to save thousands. There is an old Welsh saying, "No great misery goes unspoken." When we have a toothache, we tell people. We don't hide our pain. But because of the stigma and taboo around the word suicide, many people considering suicide don't speak plainly about their suffering. They fear our rejection. They fear that if they say something, we will ridicule them or make fun of them. As a result, people thinking about suicide often use indirect language. They hint at what they're thinking of doing. They send us coded messages, and they suffer in silence. Called suicide warning signs, QPR training teaches you how to recognize these warning signs, quickly decode them, and then question the person in an informed and compassionate manner to learn if they are considering suicide. Just as talking about physical pain helps diminish it, talking about suicide with someone willing and able to listen reduces psychological pain almost immediately. Trained QPR gatekeepers are merchants of hope, and hope helps prevent suicide. Millions of people have now been trained in QPR. Rigorous independent research studies support QPR as effective, and thousands of personal stories assure us that QPR is saving lives. When you use QPR, not everyone will be suicidal. Some people are simply stressed to the breaking point, but they still need help. help you can give. Please note that you cannot put the idea of suicide into someone's mind. People are either thinking about suicide or they're not. The fear of putting the idea of suicide into someone's head is a myth that keeps us from acting when we should do just the opposite. QPR is a universal intervention for people in pain, whether they're thinking about suicide or not. While it takes a special courage to overcome our fears, we will teach you how to ask about suicide and to offer hope through listening. Listening is the power tool that restores hope in the hopeless. We know you can do this, and we will show you how. Preventing suicide. It's what people do.
So one of the things to be mindful of when we're talking about QPR, that it's not at all intended to be any type of formal counseling or therapy or treatment, but it is intended to help encourage confidence, to intervene, as well as to offer hope through taking steps toward seeking resources, as well as other positive actions. Jennifer, before I go any further, are there any questions in the chat box?
We don't have any yet.
Okay, great. Well, if you do have any questions, just feel free to pop them in that chat box and we'll address them as we go along with the material. I want to just share with you some commonly held myths about suicide. This is one of the barriers that we're really striving to overcome, because many of these have just been ingrained in our society and in our communities as truths, when in fact they are not. So one of the first one, no one can stop a suicide, it is inevitable. This is not true. The fact is that when people are in crisis and get the help that they need, it's likely that they will never experience another suicidal episode again. So trying to get help sooner and in a more efficient manner can very likely save lives. Another myth, if you talk to someone about suicide, it's going to make them angry and it could increase the risk of suicide. The fact of the matter is that talking directly and specifically about concerns for suicide opens the door for people to have that conversation. It reduces stress and anxiety, it de-escalates the situation, and it lowers the risk of an immediate impulsive act. This last one, only experts can prevent suicide. We wouldn't be having this conversation today if that were true. The fact of the matter is that suicide is everybody's business. There are things that each one of us can do regardless of our education, regardless of the role that we play. We can prevent suicide from occurring. Another myth, suicidal people keep their plans to themselves. They don't share what they're thinking. Again, this is not true. It's been documented, and when you have conversations with people that have survived a very lethal suicide attempt, they will say, I really thought that it was clear how horrible I felt and how bad my life was, but nobody would ask me, nobody would talk to me about it. So most people do, in their own way, try to communicate how they're feeling, what their intent might be. There's also another piece of research that says that most folks who do die by suicide have made a visit to their primary care physician in the previous 4 to 6 weeks. So people are trying to get help, they're just not sure where to turn to get it. Another myth, folks who talk about suicide don't do it. The fact of the matter is that people do try to talk about it. They're just not even sure where to go to get that help or who will listen to them. And sometimes when people do talk about it and they are not heard, they feel more isolated, more cut off, and more withdrawn. Once a person decides to die by suicide, there's nothing anyone can do to stop them. Again, we know this is not true. Suicide is the most preventable manner of death, and almost any positive action can save a life. And a positive action can sometimes be as small as just saying, hey, how are you doing? Or giving somebody a kind smile. When we're talking about folks that are living with disabilities, there are just a couple of things that I wanted to touch on, and I'm certain that these are familiar to you because they can sometimes prevent conversations that can facilitate suicide prevention. So the attitudes that people may hold with concern for folks living with disabilities, that the misconception that, you know, people living with disabilities don't have the capacity to manage their lives, or might not be able to live long and healthy lives. Communication can sometimes be a barrier if language or cognition may be a part of that disability. Social barriers might be what is available to that young person within their, that individual within their community, where they're born, how they're socialized with other people, do they have access to needed care. Physical has to do with mobility and being able to access resources and care and support. If there are barriers with regards to programs that are available to support folks living with disabilities, or making accommodations for folks, can sometimes be a concern and be something that we need to give consideration to when we're having worries that somebody might be having thoughts or feelings of suicide. And this last one has to do with policies. You know, what are the policies that support folks living with disabilities? What are the policies that could be enhanced, that could improve access to healthcare as well as living conditions for folks living their best lives with their disabilities? So how can you help someone that you might identify or be concerned about who could be having thoughts or feelings of suicide? And you've probably already picked up on the fact that we believe that all you need to do is ask that question, have a conversation. We ask people questions because we care about them, because we want to learn more about what's going on in their world, and because we want to show them that they're not invisible to us. So the best way that we're going to be prepared to ask a question is to be familiar with what are warning signs. And in QPR, we align warning signs with clues. These are the things that people say or do, or actions that they might take in an effort to get our attention, and in an effort to get us to ask about what's going on. And we want to make sure that we don't discount or minimize whatever clue or warning sign we might see. So instead of running through an entire laundry list of warning signs, what I'd like to do is just share with you some catchments, some things that you should be alert and aware of that could help you be in a better position to pick up on somebody's potential suicidal ideation sooner than later. So the first thing would be direct verbal cues, what people are saying and how they're saying it. If everyone that was struggling with thoughts or feelings of suicide came right out with it and said clearly and specifically, I've decided to kill myself, I'm going to end it all, I wish I were dead, suicide prevention would be pretty straightforward and pretty easy. Sometimes people do say specific clues along these lines. This last bullet point I especially like, if XYZ, if these three things don't happen, I'll kill myself. Sometimes people use that method to get your attention in hopes that you're gonna follow back and say, what's going on? Tell me more. I'm concerned about you. Sometimes there are indirect verbal cues, and this is typically what we see most often, sort of those things that are just a little unclear for us, or that we, as a friend or colleague, might find a little easier to explain away. So indirect verbal cues, I'm tired of my life, I just can't go on. Nobody would care if I killed myself. Nobody would care if I were dead. It doesn't really matter, I'm not going to be around much longer anyway. Pretty soon you won't have to worry about me. None of these as a standalone statement might indicate that somebody's experiencing thoughts or feelings of suicide, but if it gives you that sort of feeling in the back of your mind of that's kind of out of character, or that doesn't sound too safe, or that's not something that my friend would say, we might want to follow back and get a little more information on what does that comment mean to that person in that moment of time. So what people say can be very important. How they say it can be more important. The other catchment areas are behavioral clues. These are the things that you're going to see, the changes in typical appearance, typical behaviors, different things that we would expect somebody to demonstrate. We know that if someone has experienced a suicide attempt in the past, it may be a higher risk that they may attempt again. We know that having access to any sort of lethal means, whether it's a firearm or pills or substances of any manner, could be a clue that somebody is collecting the means that they might need. If there's any type of co-occurring mental health concern, depression, moodiness, and hopelessness don't automatically equal thoughts or feelings of suicide, but they could be related to somebody feeling that their life has no value or it just doesn't matter any longer. Shoring up or tying up loose ends of personal affairs, giving away prized or sentimental possessions, changes in perception related to religion or any sort of spirituality, substance misuse or abuse, and an anger or irritability that seems out of character or inappropriate for the circumstances or situation. So you want them to look at behaviors that are out of the ordinary or atypical for an individual. The other catchment area would be situational clues. What's happening in that person's life or happening around them? So we know that anytime there's a loss, and that loss could be loss of employment, loss of education, loss of relationship, anything dealing with a disruption in something that has been long-standing, could lead someone who is vulnerable to feel like their life has no value. Being relocated, getting a diagnosis of a long-term or terminal illness, loss of financial security, a breakup of a relationship. It could be with a family member, it could be a romantic relationship, it could be a relationship of a long-standing counselor or therapist, somebody that has been helpful or a help giver to that person. This last one, fear of becoming a burden to others, is very real. People will share that I don't want to bring the rest of my family down. My care is too expensive. If my family didn't have to pay my medical bills, they wouldn't be in financial problems. So burden can look very different for many different people and can be comprised of many different circumstances and situations. The takeaway on situational clues is what's happening in that person's world, in that person's life, that could be leading them to feel that they are disconnected from support, that they are unworthy, or that they are feeling hopeless and helpless within the situation that they're trying to live in. I like this statement. When asking questions, we need to take into consideration the individual's social, cognitive, and communication challenges. It's important to understand how they perceive their social world and whether they feel integrated or isolated. And while this has, the comment came from Roma Vasa of the Center for Autism and Related Disorders, I think that it also is very appropriate when we're talking about suicide. It's how that individual perceives themselves, both socially, emotionally, and how they're able to express that, and how they see things happening in their world. So how do we use all of this information to help us ask that question about concerns for suicide? Well, here are just a few tips. We want to make sure that if we are concerned that somebody might be thinking about suicide, we don't want to wait. We don't want to explain it away. We want to find the courage to ask the question directly and specifically as soon as possible. We also need to be persistent because, as I spoke just a moment ago, sometimes people are unsure who they can trust. They don't want to put fear into other people or create unnecessary worry. So we might need to just be a little more persistent and push on some concerns that we may be having. We want to be respectful of the individual and try to have a private conversation and give them the opportunity to speak as freely and as openly as they're comfortable doing. And we want to make sure we allow plenty of time. The last thing that we want to be sure that we have on hand are resources. And I already said that I would be sharing the QPR card, but it's important that we know who our community resources are. It's important that we know who our workplace resources might be. And having ready access to that information is very important. I'll cover a little bit more of that in just a minute. So be mindful that it takes courage to have this conversation, And it's not as important the words or how you ask the question, but that you're able to get that question out and initiate the conversation with the individual that you may be concerned about. So the question, we want to be direct and specific. Here are just a couple of examples of language that we might want to use. This first one is, I call this the setup. We're acknowledging that there's some distress in this person's life, and we're also normalizing to some extent that sometimes people wish they might be dead, and I'm wondering if you're feeling that way too. So it would sound like, you know, when people are as upset as you seem to be, they sometimes wish that they were dead. I'm wondering if you're feeling that way too. Or just asking about what you can visually see. You know, you look pretty miserable. I'm wondering if you're thinking about suicide. This last one, straightforward. Are you thinking about killing yourself? There's really no way to get around that question. It's pretty straightforward. Now, people often say to me, you know, Elizabeth, I don't know, that's just like too in your face. I don't think I could just ask somebody that question, which I totally understand, and it makes a lot of sense. So there are some less direct ways that we can ask the question as well. So let's just use this example where we have noticed that somebody has been emotionally off their game. They seem very unhappy. We can just ask a series of questions. You know, you've been unhappy lately, and it seems like you've been getting a lot more unhappy. It's been more difficult on a day-to-day basis for you. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about ending your life. This last question on the slide, do you ever wish you could go to sleep and never wake up? That seems like a pretty simple question. And I just want to share with you, there is research behind that question, that is a very balanced question to ask. It gives us the opportunity to follow up, and it really normalizes the circumstance that having thoughts of suicide is not that unusual, but taking action on those thoughts of suicide is. This statement, do you ever wish you could go to sleep and never wake up, has been researched through the Columbia Suicide Severity Screen, and it's one of the questions that many assessment tools use to help them in determining the level of suicidal ideation somebody might be experiencing. So the questions. Oops. While there are positive ways to ask the question, we also want to make sure that we're not asking a question in such a way that it begs for the answer to be no, such as this first one. We don't want to be patronizing or minimizing or telling somebody that that's a stupid thing to do. And we want to make sure that we're not doing anything that makes the individual feel that we're judging them in any way. And so all three of these statements are just examples of things that we want to stay away from. When asking the question, we want to demonstrate empathy and compassion. We want to use open-ended questions that allow for conversation. And we want to validate that the pain and despair that that individual is experiencing is very real. And we want to be part of the process of helping them to find a way to live through that and work through that pain. So to yourself, we're just going to do a little activity. What I would like for you to do, while this says partner, what I'd like for you to do is just out loud at your workspace, say the words, "Are you having thoughts of suicide?" Knowing that the response to that question is going to be no. So take a couple seconds and just do it. So this is a good situation, right? We've identified somebody that we're concerned about. We've asked them, "Are you having thoughts of suicide?" And they say no. So then what do we say to that statement of no? We want to express gratefulness. We want to encourage them to be safe. We want to let them know that if those thoughts ever were present, that we want to be a resource for them. And we also want to let them know that any access to lethal means could elevate risk. So some examples of that might be, okay, but if you ever were, I want you to know I care about you and I want you to be safe. Validating, as well as offering empathy. It's good to hear. I know you've got a lot of stressful things going on. Again, recognizing that their emotional safety could be at risk, and we see that they are struggling. So this next section, what I'd like for you to do is while you're sitting at your workspace in front of your computer, ask the question again, are you having thoughts of suicide? But this time, imagine that your partner says, yes, I am, and say the words out loud. So a lot of times people will tell me, you know, that felt really awkward, it felt forced, and absolutely it does. My experience has been the more we give ourselves the opportunity to practice saying these things out loud, the less overwhelming and fearful they become to us. So that's why I'm asking you to participate in this short activity. So the answer was yes. What do we say to yes this time? Pretty much along the same lines that we would say to no. And we want to acknowledge that it took a lot of courage, a lot of bravery to share that information. And they're trusting you with it. So acknowledge that. Thank you for trusting me with that. Recognize that somebody that is experiencing thoughts or feelings of suicide might very well feel that they're trapped or they're stuck or that they have no options. And conveying that back in a caring way can go far. Just saying, I'm really worried about you, what's going on, acknowledging that it's an unsafe situation. I'm sorry that you feel that way and I'm glad you shared it with me. Again, just being part of the process of helping that person get the care that they need. So then what's next? This is where the next step of the QPR model comes in. We want to persuade. We want to persuade hope and help and change. We want to give space for that person to talk about what the problem in their life is, because suicide is not the problem. Suicide is the solution. The problem is everything else that's going on or going wrong or causing distress for that person, and we want to talk about that. We know that the simple act of talking and venting, if you will, reduces and de-escalates situations. So we want to encourage the individual that we're concerned about to talk to us. We want to make sure that we are not judging them and say, that sounds really difficult. Tell me a little bit more about that. Or it sounds like you're trying to do the best that you can. Sounds really rough, really tough. I know that this is hard for you, but I also know that with some support and some help, you would be able to get through this. Whatever that hope might look like, whatever that hope might sound like, it can go far in helping somebody reverse their thoughts of suicide. Once we've had that conversation, we want to continue to be part of that process. We want our friend or our colleague or our family member to know that we're there with them. So we would offer, will you go with me to get help? Actually be present with them. Asking permission, will you let me get you help? Having them be part of the process, have a voice in what's going to happen next. And also this last point, will you promise me not to kill yourself until we found some help? A lot of times people have said to me, you know, I doubt people that are suicidal would ever promise to do anything like that. And in reality, the very opposite is true. People are willing, if they feel supported and they feel that your best interest is to help them, they will make that promise. It's not a lifelong promise, but it's a promise that they can make to stay safe for now. So our part of our QPR is being able to refer folks, and that's why it's so important that you are familiar with what your community resources are and how you might access them. These are just a few steps just to be alert and be aware of. Sometimes when folks are suicidal, they feel hopeless, that there is no help for them. So you might need to do a little bit more. This goes back to the comments I made a little bit earlier about being more persistent. We know that the best referral involves being with them, so being present and taking them directly to somebody who might be helpful. That could be somebody in HR, human resources. It could be taking them to see a counselor. It could be taking them to the emergency room if you feel that it's that significant. Getting them to make a commitment that they will seek help. Yes, I realize I could benefit from getting some help. I want to do some research on where I might find a counselor or a therapist. And the third best referral is to be prepared to give them a telephone hotline or to get a good faith commitment from them that they're not going to attempt suicide. And know that any willingness to accept help, even in the future, is a good outcome. Part of the QPR model is recognizing that there are boundaries of things that we can do that help people to stay safe. So just keep in mind that since all efforts to persuade someone to live instead of attempt suicide will be met with agreement and relief, don't hesitate to get involved or take the lead. That's just giving you the opportunity to ask these questions and to get out there and to be part of the process of helping them to stay safe. I'm going to skip this case study because I want to be aware of time and allow a few minutes for questions at the end. So for effective QPR, just a couple of things to be mindful of. Be as genuine as you possibly can. And if you don't feel you're the right person to initiate a conversation with someone that might be struggling with thoughts or feelings of suicide, try to connect them with somebody that can. Here's some language that you can put around that in being genuine. I'm worried about your safety. I care about you. Let's work through this. With everything that's going on, you might feel overwhelmed. Again, just being empathic, validating the circumstances for what they are, and that willingness to be present and be part of helping them get the support that they need. You might also want to consider who else can help you help this person. Other family members, somebody from your faith community, perhaps the individual's physician. Many organizations, particularly schools, and more so behavioral health organizations, have crisis teams. So perhaps connect that individual with a crisis team, someplace that might be able to provide them a next level of help or support. At the very least, we want to be available and stay engaged and involved. So follow up, give a phone call, send a card. Say something, initiate a conversation, anything that is comfortable for you engaging with that individual. It lets them know that you care about them, that it wasn't just in the moment that you were being sincere. It was for a much longer window of time. And as I've said before, that you want to be part of that process of helping them feel supported and connected. So just as a couple of takeaways, when you use QPR, you're planting the seeds of hope. QPR is a prevention and intervention. It's intended to help somebody before their thoughts or feelings of suicide escalate to the point that they might need more significant or psychiatric care. Hope helps build connection. We know that when people feel connected, they feel less alone, they feel less isolated, they feel more supported, and they're more agreeable to seeking help. And we also know that connections prevent suicide. So the more connected somebody feels, the more hopeful and the more possibilities there are that suicide will not be the choice that they make, and that you will have been part of the process of helping somebody get to a point where life is the choice that they choose to make. So are there any questions or comments from anyone?
We do have a few in the chat box. And
okay.
This is about COVID, and they were wondering how COVID impacts the attempt or death by suicide, and will the data be available in Missouri in the near future regarding this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So at this point, we have not seen a significant spike in suicide-related deaths as a result of COVID. There's certainly concern, specifically because of all of the different risk factors that COVID is presenting in our communities across the board. One of the issues that we have, not only here in Missouri, but across the United States, is there's a delay in reporting of suicide deaths, and there's also a delay in investigating those deaths. So getting reliable data in real time with regard to suicide is very difficult. I can tell you that the Missouri Suicide Prevention Network is working very closely with the Department of Health and Senior Services, which is the primary data collection system within the state, to try to identify ways that we can overcome that data barrier. But at this point in time, getting good data in real time is not something that's possible. So we really rely on communities to share when they've heard that there's been a loss of life to suicide, and we try to take action along those lines.
The person who asked that question says, thanks so much. So I think
You're welcome.
you answered it.
You're welcome. Good.
Let's see, a couple people have asked me if there was any way to get a copy of the presentation, and I know those are hard to send with videos, but do you have any recommendations of if there are portions of the PowerPoint or spots that people can go to get the same information?
I would be happy to send you an edited slide deck, Jennifer, if you wanted to make it available. So I can certainly do that.
Absolutely. And so when I post the email address to email for CEUs, you can just email that same address if you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint, and I'll add you to that list. Okay, another question. When a person has had suicidal ideation and is seeing a therapist but does not open up to them for fear of hospitalization, how can they be helped?
That is an excellent question, and it's a quandary that unfortunately happens quite frequently. The fear of being hospitalized is very real, and unfortunately, hospitalization is not a good treatment for suicidal ideation. It can sometimes intensify some of the thoughts and feelings. In a situation as you describe, if you are a friend or family member and you are alert and aware that someone you care about might be struggling with thoughts or feelings of suicide, be that person that connects with them, that talks with them. Let them know that there are other resources that they can turn to get help, to get some support. We're very lucky here in the state of Missouri. We've got an excellent hotline system, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-8255, is a great resource for people who are living with thoughts or feelings of suicide, as well as people that are trying to help someone with those thoughts or feelings. We're also very lucky here in Missouri. We have a dedicated short code for texting with the crisis text line, which would be MOSAFE, MOSAFE, and text that to 741-741. Another intervention that can be very helpful for folks when they're struggling with thoughts or feelings of suicide. Crisis text line is staffed by volunteers, and their whole purpose is to help people de-escalate their crisis and get from a hot, unsafe place to a cool, calm, safer place. I hope that answers your question.
We have another one too. As a mandated reporter, can you address how to handle a person's unwillingness to go to the hospital or our responsibility to report?
Yes, so mandated reporters, you just need to really include the person that you're concerned about in as much decision making as you can. Let them know that being a mandated reporter is not punitive, that you're concerned about their safety, that you are sharing the information per your policy, and that intention is to get that individual the help and care that they are deserving of and need. Depending on who you're reporting to, you know, that is going to also be part of the conversation that I would encourage you to share with that person. Yeah.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And the person who asked your last question, you said you hoped it helped. She said it was very helpful. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. I
don't see any other questions in our chat box, but we have okay, we just got one. I'm an employment specialist. I've had a couple of clients relapse during COVID and their counselors are not meeting face-to-face. They have reached out to me and I gladly listen, but what is the best route for them to, okay, my question box just moved. What is the best route for them to get assistance when their counselors are not meeting?
Yes, that's a great question. So we're really lucky here in the state. You may have at home gotten a postcard from Show Me Hope, which is a resource that has been funded through the CARES Act, and it's designated specifically to support folks who need that extra level of support, who may have been impacted through COVID. And they have a website. Let's see, I have it pulled up here. Oops, wrong mouse. The Show Me Hope, where to go? It's showmehope.org, I think, is a great resource. It's MOSHOWMEHOPE.org, showmehope.org, and it takes you to a website where you can access the different organizations that are participating in that. They also have access to telehealth. So in this specific case that you're talking about, there's the potential that exists that they might be able to do some telehealth with that with the person that you're concerned about. I hope that helps.
Fantastic. I think these have been really great questions, and I'm so glad we had this opportunity to chat a little bit at the end. I don't see any more pop up, and we are nearing our end of the hour. Is there anything else you'd like to share, Elizabeth, before we part ways for the day?
Yeah, so actually I'm going to try to upload into the chat box a couple of resources that you can refer back to. Let's see. Here. If you'll just bear with me for just a moment.
While you do that, I can go ahead and share the email address for everyone to send CEU requests to, and give you a second to find those.
Okay.
If anyone would like CEUs, please email mrastatechapter@gmail.com, and I just put that address in the chat box as well. Also, if you would like a copy of the PowerPoints, if you could email that same address. If you would put either CEUs or PowerPoint in the subject, or both, that would be really helpful for me to organize. It looks like Elizabeth found it.
Yep, I just put the gatekeeper card in the chat box, as well as the review materials as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has just been an incredible training, and there's so many, comments to me privately in the chat and to everyone in the chat about how amazing this training has been. And we just so appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise with us. And, MRA just thanks you so much for this, Elizabeth.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. I appreciate the invitation, and I'm glad that the material has been well received. And I hope that everybody feels a little more comfortable and confident following up with some concerns that you might have. So take this information and pay it forward.
Absolutely. Well, for everyone who logged on, thank you so much for spending part of your afternoon with us. Like I said, the email for CEUs and for the slideshow is in the comments. Please feel free to grab that and send us an email. And don't forget, we have webinars coming up every Wednesday this month at 2 o'clock. And next week, we will be learning how to utilize momentum in criminal justice reform to create avenues of change in the labor market. And that presentation will be from Brittany Peterson and Tracy Kirksey from the Second Chance Risk Reduction Center. You can find more details on our website. I've been sharing that link out as well. And we just really hope to see you some throughout the rest of the month as well. But thank you all so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Bye.